What are the limits of your capacity to forgive? It's something a remarkable woman in BC spent years considering before she made one of the most difficult decisions imaginable. We get her story from the CBC's Duncan McHugh.
What happened in the early morning hours of May 27, 1994 is indeed hellish. Debbie was asleep when her 18-year-old stepson Chris barged into her bedroom wearing a mask and waving a pellet gun. He tied her up and then took the children into another room. She got loose, he returned, and that's when her real ordeal began.
He hit me in the head with the hammer right there, and as we fell down, he ended up on my back. Ended up bashing me in the back of the head with the hammer as well, while I tried to ask him, what did I do to deserve this? What's going on?
For the next 6 hours, Chris Warsing ransacked the house and assaulted his stepmother. He bound her hands with zip ties, beat her head with piggy banks, shot her with a pellet gun, and stabbed her with a barbecue rotisserie in the cheek, neck, shoulder, chest, hands, and thighs 16 times in all, as Debbie went in and out of consciousness.
Just pure fear. I didn't have a clue why this was happening and where did he put the kids. That's all I wanted. I wanted the kids out of the house.
Eventually, a bloodied Debbie fought her way out of the house. A terrified neighbor phoned police. Chris fled, sparking an intensive manhunt. He was caught the next day, 30 kilometers away. By then, Debbie had discovered what happened to her children.
A friend who's an RCMP officer came to my hospital room and I asked, have they found him? And he said yes. I said, oh, thank God, are they okay? And he said no. And basically my world fell apart. That's when I knew I'd been fighting for dead children all night.
7-year-old Stuart and 8-month-old Shannon were found wrapped in bed sheets, strangled to death. Debbie did her best to move on. She and Chris's father divorced. Debbie remarried and moved to Vancouver to start a new life.
Chris Warsing was also near Vancouver, in jail, where he was diagnosed with manic depressive disorder. He began psychiatric treatment, and then more than a decade after the crime, he made an extraordinary request.
He asked to meet with his stepmother, Debbie, which is how the people at the Restorative Justice Center got involved. Chris met Sandy Bergen, a mediator who specializes in uniting victims and offenders.
A lot of offenders, so frequently we hear, I wrote a letter of apology, my lawyer told me to tear it up. Or I wrote a letter of apology and I had no way of getting it to the victim. And on the victim side we hear, he doesn't show any remorse. I don't think he's sorry for what he did. And so how do you make those two things come together? And this is one way that we can.
A face-to-face meeting was arranged, just Chris and Debbie, with Sandy there for support.
It always is so powerful to see how quickly they get through that initial emotion and just sit there and start to talk to each other as though, you know, all those years hadn't happened, all those things hadn't happened. I mean, obviously that's still there, the pain and the crime, but it's two human beings talking about it, and it's just the compassion that comes through.
Which is why, after 2 years and one more meeting with Chris, Debbie Warsing is heading for a parole hearing, rehearsing in her head a victim impact statement, asking for Chris to be released. Facing 3 members of the parole board, Chris Warsing tells his side of the story. After his father's first divorce, he wanted to die. In deluded hopes that his brother and sister would be spared that pain, he killed them. Now he says he can control his illness. So when Debbie stood up to support him, he was a puddle of tears. After listening, the parole board granted him conditional day parole, saying it is satisfied that your risk will not be undue and recommending a gradual, structured approach to reintegration. Chris was ordered to keep taking medication and continue his psychiatric and psychological treatment. Deb met with Chris after the hearing. Together, they wept.
We've waited 15 years for today. It's been a long time coming. Glad it's over, at least for now.
Chris is now out of prison, living in a supervised halfway house in Chilliwack. He works part-time as a gardener and landscaper. He has a driver's license and he plans to attend university.
We all have our secrets. We all have things that we've done that we're not proud of, that we're ashamed of. Is that how we would want to be identified for the rest of our lives?
So this is Stuart's teddy bear that he first got when he was first born.
Meanwhile, Debbie's healing continues. She doesn't know what to do with the children's ashes.
And they're in the closet. On their birthdays, I still go in and give the urn a rub and say happy birthday to them. Christmas, it's Merry Christmas to them before anybody.
She's agreed to meet with Chris from time to time in public places. She believes the mediation worked.
My puzzle was always partially completed. And once we started a dialogue, even though the puzzle pieces weren't technically about what happened that night, the little pieces of my life started falling back together. It put me back together.
Closure? Not exactly. But to understand and embrace a killer, that was the glue Deb Warsing needed to mend her damaged soul. Duncan McHugh, CBC News, Vancouver.